let's cut to the chase. With the reveal of Evolved Mode, we were told that synergy actions, quote-unquote, were getting removed. Both in the sense that Evolved Mode, of course, just won't have them, at least that's the implication, and that Reborn Mode Jobs will lose them. What's a synergy action, you ask? A lot of players may know them as damage-increasing raid buffs, or simply raid buffs. Effects that increase the damage output of your party. Now, I'm probably neither the first nor the last to have suggested that a change like this would be necessary to be able to embrace enough variety in job designs to also match each job's identity in a fitting way, instead of them all feeling sort of forced to do roughly the same thing or risk being unviable, quote-unquote. I have a whole separate video about the topic of perfect game balance being an impossible endeavor if you're interested in more of that in particular, but with that out of the way, let's get to the first of the two main topics of this video. Does it actually matter? And does it add meaning to the game? As of the release of Dawntrail, I can say with certainty that nearly every single job in Final Fantasy XIV matches one of the following rotational designs. Full burst every minute, taking roughly 20 seconds. Small burst on the odd minute, big burst on the even minute. 2 charges with a 40-second charge time, naturally resulting in 1 use on the odd minute and 2 in the even. With the release of Endwalker effectively introducing the strict 2-minute burst meta by design over the course of the expansion, outliers were gradually fitted in, with some examples being Warrior's Inner Release being changed from a 90-second cooldown to a 60-second cooldown with Endwalker's launch, cooldowns like SIs and Flemmer eventually getting adjusted to 40-second cooldowns instead of 45-second cooldowns, and Paladin getting overhauled to have a consistently easily plannable 20-second burst on every minute instead of what it had before. Whether these changes are for the better or not is somewhat subjective, but it is difficult to argue that these changes would still have happened if it wasn't for the impact of the 2-minute burst meta itself sort of requiring it for these jobs to, well, either compete in the meta or to feel good to play. Like, take Flemmer. When it was on a 45-second charge time, some 2-minute bursts you could fit both Flemmers inside. Others, you couldn't, which could make the job feel a bit weirdly designed as a result. Granted, you might not even want to fit both in due to the mobility it offers. Anyway, Sage was definitely not the only one here. Some might argue that Red Mage still has this feeling due to Flesh and Contra Sixt. What is pretty funny here is that a bunch of jobs throughout Endwalker ended up with 20-second bursts, or nearly that, as a result of burst consolidations, which in turn led to the burst buffs themselves being adjusted from a variety of 15 to 30-second buffs to all being 20-second buffs, so that all of these flashy bursts can fit. That said, I think that there can be no doubt that a lot of jobs have been changed in a very real way to fit this specific design, and while these jobs do have somewhat different feeling bursts and fillers, it is worth considering that in the before times, jobs had differently timed peaks and valleys, different approaches to what a burst even is, and some even decided that they just don't have one. Not really. So while we can point to particular jobs and say that they're all the same by exaggerating a bit, and similarly we can point to the same jobs and say they're all completely different by exaggerating something else a bit, they most definitely used to be more distinct. When it comes to content, for the more casual player, while raid buffs being coordinated can make a duty go faster, it is generally just something that can overlap but might not. This, interestingly, leads to certain jobs that sort of rely on the burst window to give the job's rotation structure, where it otherwise would just be press things on cooldown. When it comes to harder content, parties start to at least try to coordinate bursts more, which includes the generally accepted and popular openers for fights having, for some jobs, seemingly unexplained slow starts that, when you look closer, come down to the fact that most jobs benefit a lot from having a couple of attacks before the burst starts. Which is to say, the reason the Dark Knight does a full 1-2-3 combo before blasting off is because the Warrior kinda really would appreciate it if we could all slow down and let him have his 1-2-3 combo first. And when we move a bit higher to the hardest content on offer, whether it be Savage or Ultimate that we talk about, a huge part of maximizing your damage comes down to making the most of these bursts, split by 2-minute intervals. At its most extreme, or ultimate levels I suppose, it could be argued that the difficulty of a DPS check can be simplified to how much damage needs to be done and indeed how much time you have to get it done. But more importantly, how many multiples of 2 minutes you have, simply due to how much of a job's damage originates from the burst itself. This problem, quote unquote, is sort of also exacerbated in its own way by boss design seemingly adhering to making sure players get to have their 2-minute bursts. Obviously, the designer could just not let you have those, but considering how much damage the 2-minute bursts represent, deliberately preventing the players from having their burst both feels bad for the player, while simultaneously sort of requiring the designer to then assume a lower damage potential as a result. An example of this kind of adherence to these strict burst windows, I feel we can see in the first phase of M12S, Lindworm Savage. Assuming you run a typical opener, then the 3-minute burst timing in this fight is so perfectly timed that the boss becomes untargetable just in time for you to finish a 20-second burst, assuming you spent around 3 GCDs in the opener setting up. I'd argue there might be better examples, but considering the devs have acknowledged this problem, it is very possible Heavyweight Savage was made deliberately trying to break this cycle. Which is to say, I could hop on and on about how this 2-minute burst stuff is stiff and boring or whatever, but when it comes to truly optimizing this stuff, it actually gets a lot more complicated than send it all on cooldown. And at least some of the very best players in the game enjoy this dynamic, and find that the strategy involved in coordinating these buffs across a full party is a lot more interesting than the possible alternative. Not having that, I guess. But I feel this somewhat segues us awkwardly over to the second main topic. Historically, 14 has had team burst windows for longer than it has not. Long story short, most players that have stuck with 14 for a long time, and more importantly, has dedicated so much of their time to become among the best at it, are extremely likely to have chosen this game over others because of this specific combat design. So it makes sense for a player like that to be extra worried about the suggestion of the removal of this system altogether. That was why they decided to play this game and not a different one. The teamwork. Let me try and give a sort of brief history lesson on how team burst windows worked through the years, and please excuse some inaccuracies or perhaps vagueness here and there, and if you know how it really went down, do feel free to add extra clarifications in the comments. In A Realm Reborn, initially, the only damage-increasing raid buffs available were the maintainable piercing, slashing, and blunt resist down debuffs that increased the damage of certain physical attacks, as well as Foe Requiem, which was a bard spell that maintained a negative aura that caused enemies to have reduced magic resistance. For Foe Requiem specifically, it cost MP to maintain, so it had downtime, so it might have lasted a long time and then had a long downtime, but that was it. Jobs were also all over the place when it came to bursts. Some jobs didn't really have anything resembling a burst, some might have one, but the cooldown was stupidly long, or maybe the burst was so weak that it wasn't really worth talking about. Then Ninja was added, and Trick Attack made everyone do more damage for a brief 10 seconds. A player getting into the game in A Realm Reborn may have been more focused on the teamwork at large than these coordinated team burst windows. With Heavensward, Dragoon got access to Battle Litany, and Machinist was added with Hypercharge, a button that caused their persistent turret to make the enemy take more damage from specific damage types. And of course, Astrologian was added with the capacity to boost the whole party's damage by 10% thanks to what the balance was capable of. And after this bit of real taste of synergistic actions, we started to go into overdrive. In Stormblood, Bard was reworked to maintain a damage increasing buff with their songs, and Battle Voice was reworked to how it works today. Mostly. Summoners Garuda and Ifrit pets got ways to apply a magic damage increasing effect and physical damage increasing effect respectively, and also got Ether Pact, applying Devotion, a buff that, among other things, increased damage output. Scholar got Chain Stratagem, Red Mage was added with Embolden, Monk got Brotherhood, increasing only physical damage though, and Dragoon got Dragon Sight, a buff they could share with one other person. But all of these buffs, as well as the ones that were already there, were all over the place when it comes to cooldowns, with something like Trick Attack on a 1-minute cooldown, and Ether Pact on 3 minutes, Brotherhood on 90 seconds, Dragon Sight on 2 minutes. Who really won were the jobs that could reliably overlap the most buffs with the timing at which they also peaked their damage output. Sometimes, there could even be a discussion about delaying a buff to align it with another one. Maybe. Shadowbringers mainly continued the trend by adding Dancer into the mix, but also highlighted something that maybe later led to Endwalker's changes. From Heavensward to Stormblood, Astrologian had incredible party buffing capability, but it required skill and luck to set it up, which made it really unreliable in a way. And considering damage cards were what was focused on anyway, the system was reworked with Divination as the centerpiece. A simple raid buff to build up to, instead of that old complicated stuff, making it easier to get the payoff that was the target to begin with. Perhaps it would be better if the whole concept of coordinating raid buffs wasn't so much about planning and more about simply doing it. And so, Endwalker normalized all damage increasing raid buffs to align with a 2-minute loop, and most jobs were adjusted to fit in if they didn't already. And by now, I think most would agree that Black Mage and maybe Machinist in a way are the only jobs that aren't made to fit in this strict system. And this is important because that means that when Evercold comes, yes, every combat job will have an evolved mode style for us to try, but the jobs that existed prior to Evercold will keep their Reborn Mode styles too, for you to fall back on. But what does that even mean if what, for a lot of old-timer players, was the glue that kept all these jobs together, at least at this point, has been removed? To give an example of what I mean by that, the current Dawntrail rendition of Dark Knight has a selection of cooldowns that optimally you press right when they come up, as soon as you have aligned them with the raid buff window, of course. However, what motivates to hold 2 uses of Shadowbringer for a big burst, as well as holding a lot of MP for the Edge of Shadow spam, is precisely the opportunity to use them while benefiting from buffs from others. Meaning, in a duty with no raid buffs available, just sending your attacks when you have them with no thinking is just as good as holding them, for the most part. Essentially, what gives Dark Knight reason to produce this big explosive burst of attacks is the existence of raid buffs, and without them, this selling point of Dark Knight sort of just doesn't matter. You can just press the buttons when you want to. For some players, this is of course a good thing, and for others, it's just really boring. So, to finish off on a more hopeful and positive note, while raid buffs and burst windows like this have been part of 14 for so long that the vast majority of current players either don't remember or never knew anything different, that doesn't mean that something different cannot be for the better. When it comes to the jobs we have seen demonstrated in Evolved mode already, both Dragoon and Bard demonstrated ways that their defensive toolkits could lead to a more impactful presence in a party than they could with their damage increasing raid buffs. When it comes to the feel of a job's presence in a party, for damage increasing raid buffs, a lot of the time, it doesn't really matter for me whether the damage buff comes from a Dragoon, a Bard, or an Astrologian, just whether it is or is not coming. Damage is damage. When it comes to defensive buffs, things often become a lot more complicated, and we even see this in things like our World First race where maybe a monk is picked over a samurai, specifically because Riddle of Earth and Mantra are preferred over Tengetsu. I don't have evidence to suggest whether that was the reason or not, I'm simply saying it could be. And in that sense, assuming things stay somewhat as they are, come Evercold, a smart Dragoon might be able to soak a mechanic that normally requires 2, 3, or maybe even 4 players completely alone by timing their sky high wisely. Assuming this is a somewhat unique option, this would absolutely make a difference in strategy whether you do or do not have a Dragoon. Somewhat similarly, Bard's songs in Evercold give access to a heal over time, a speed boost, and a barrier, so ordering your songs in certain ways can be impactful to make the most of each of these effects, and you can probably tell the difference between a Bard that bothers to time the barrier song before raid wide compared to one that just mindlessly sends the region song because they don't care anyway. In short, this sort of defensive cooldown design could lead to much cooler ways for teams to work together than what we already have. But new things are scary. But what do you think? Is 2-minute bursts and the teamwork it induces exactly what makes 14? Well, 14. Or are you happy to finally get rid of this nonsense so you can finally live your dream of smashing your face on the keyboard and maybe doing maximum damage? Or maybe something more in between? I would love to hear about it all in the comments. Now, that is all for this video. Thank you so much for watching. If you would like to support me and my channel more directly, you can become a member like these wonderful people here. You can also alternatively support me through Twitch or Ko-Fi. Links in the description. You can also support the channel by letting the YouTube algorithm know by liking the video, leaving a comment, subscribing, sharing, and hitting the bell to get notified when next I post a video. Fun fact, originally Bard's battle voice doubled the Bard's current song's effects for its duration, and also had a 5-minute cooldown. This could include Foe Requiem, or effects like Mage's Ballad or Army's Paean, which at the time recovered MP and TP respectively.